and we use those to drive sustainable impact. So what we're going to talk about today are these three things. What are the Sustainable Development Goals and why do they exist? How can we use them to drive sustainable impact, both as an individual and through projects? So individually, you can do things as an individual. You can do them as an individual at your work, through businesses and communities. But then thirdly, how do we manage our projects sustainably? And when you think about the ABCs of something, it's sort of the concept is, what is the basic? What is the basic information about something? And so that's what we're looking at here. And then I also decided, well, let's apply ABCs to these concepts, not in the exact same order, but I'm using creative license. We'll have a background on the first one. We'll talk about us as global citizens. And then as project managers, project management professionals, business professionals, how we can apply the Sustainable Development Goals. So in the at the end of World War II, a lot of the world had explosive industrial growth. And what happened with that is we identified, or in this book, Silent Spring, the author identified that growth came at a cost. So our nature of Earth is vulnerable to human intervention, that when we were making developments in the economy, for us socially as people, we were actually causing harm to the environment. So this was sort of a wake-up call. There had been an environmental movement previous, but this really ignited it. It really made it clear to at least Western populations that there was a connection between environment, economy, and social well-being. And this is in 1962. From that came the sustainability pillars. So we talked about the environment, economy, social well-being, and those map to people, planet, and profit. You can see that mapping. Now, projects are how it all happens. So we've got people projects, projects that help people and the communities and society. We have projects that help the planet, the environment, the earth. And then from a profit perspective, that's the economy and business. When you look at those, it's important to recognize that we need to balance those. And so when an example of that is, we actually, in Project Managers Without Borders, we partnered with the Rotary Club, and they had a project in Madagascar where they had dug some wells, put together all of the equipment so that people there could have fresh water, clean water. But what ended up happening is the economy of it didn't really work very well. So the social well-being was pretty good. The people got some water, but it cost so much per gallon, per liter, whatever it was, that it really wasn't something that could be sustained when anything broke or later on. And so they didn't have a balance. So when we partnered with them, we found a community in Mexico that Rotary wanted to use find another community that they could help provide clean water. We found this community in Mexico and thought, this is great, until we found out that if we had provided the wells that Rotary was planning on providing, then that would take away the work, the business, the jobs of the people who had the water trucks. It might have made it less expensive, for the community, or maybe not, but it would be harming the economy of an entire group of people. And so these are things to really keep in mind as we move forward with our projects, the sustainability and balancing these pillars. So that was in the 60s. Decades later, the United Nations identified that, well, there were several efforts in between. I'm not going to be talking about all of them, but identified that we really needed to look at this connection between these three pillars. And this Brundtland Commission report came out of some effort from there. The most important part of this report is the sustainable development definition, which is on the screen. It's development that meets the needs of the present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we hadn't had that concept. They actually coined the phrase sustainable development and popularized it as well. And so that helped altogether, bringing in the concept of saving the environment, which people were now thinking of since the 60s a lot more, but then also preventing the deterioration of economic and social development. That balance is essential. So out of that came some other efforts. Now we're moving over to 2010 or 2000. And in 2000, a lot of time went by again. And so there were lots of efforts, but there were a lot of problems with the efforts. The Millennium Development Goals were released at the millennium. It was an opportunity for the United Nations to really kickstart the concept, because they had had some problems with their prior implementations and efforts. So what they did is they identified these goals. You can see the 8 of them on the screen. And it was actually a commitment between all of the UN member states. They all pledged to achieve these 8 goals by 2015. Now, there was more information behind the goals besides what you see on the screen, but they really identified that they allowed a centralized development cooperation. Organizations were involved, governments were involved, and many got together and actually accomplished quite a bit with the thought of these 8 goals in mind. But they had a lot of issues as well. There were a lot of concerns. Some people thought that it was capitalism and globalization from the wealthier countries. They're trying to force that on the rest of the world. Others saw that the targets were too restrictive. There are 8. And it's not about numbers, but the scope was just too limited. It didn't provide, say, human rights information or employment, economic growth, anything like that. And these are all complicated issues in our world. And when you think about the United Nations is looking at it from a global perspective. And it seemed to a lot of people that the globe, all of the stakeholders in the world were not tapped into to identify these goals and to go forward with them. So though a lot was accomplished, it wasn't really getting to the point that what we wanted, what the United Nations wanted, and the member states that signed on to pledge to achieve those goals. So enter the Sustainable Development Goals. So you've probably seen this graphic. It's fantastic. It's nice and colorful. You can kind of understand where some of the colors have come from, but it was clear to the UN that they needed something to replace the Millennium Development Goals. Actually, when you looked at them, originally there were 8 of them, as I mentioned, and some of the people looked at them and said, well, they're actually MDGs stands for Minimum Development Goals. And so the SDGs were able to resolve some of the issues that the world had with the MDGs. Not just because there are more, but they really took the concepts. They really listened. So they set up a couple of teams. One of them was to come up with new goals. And there were face-to-face meetings with the public to identify what kind of goals and where it would all fit. All the member countries had an opportunity to provide their input. They actually went door to door in different places, community to community in different places to get feedback. They talked with NGOs and civil society organizations, CSOs, and they had surveys online. So this concept brought together all sorts of input from the stakeholders of the world, which is really what was needed in order to do this. So to advance this this concept. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. That's the point of it. Now, what they've done is they've packaged it into easily understood goals, which you could use to promote awareness and cooperation. And the key point is to have greater impact. So it's really a central component of a lot of developmental plans for countries and foreign aid strategies as well. All of the 193 United Nations member states are committed to achieving the goals. They've expressed their commitment by 2030. So this is identified in 2015, and the goals are to be completed. Their targets are at 2030. They're not legally binding, but what we do have is governments have committed to taking ownership and really identifying that they will be establishing their national frameworks for these achievements. The way that they're held accountable for this is through regular reporting. So they have reporting to the United Nations. There are so many organizations that are involved in the Sustainable Development Goals. They're, as I mentioned, NGOs, CSOs, corporations, governments. Governments are a huge part because, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about Earth, the globe. I can do something as an individual. I can do something at work. My not-for-profit can do something in the world, but our reach, our scope is only so far. We need a lot of those to have an impact, and to really have an Earth impact, a global impact. The governments are really where you see a lot of focus for this. But it's not just about governments. So when the global compact is also a UN concept. So it is focused on businesses, looking at it is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. You can partner with the United Nations as a business, and there are tons of resources that are available to organizations out there through the Global Compact. And at the end of this presentation, I have a bunch of links. There's a link to where you can find information about this and all of these other areas that I'm talking about. So the Global Compact, there are just so many opportunities to make a difference in the world through the Global Compact. But this specifically focuses on companies, organizations, businesses. One of the key points that they make is they're trying to help businesses change their strategy so that their actions are strategically advancing the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, when we look at the 17 goals that I had up earlier, I'm not going to go through every one and explain them. There is so much information out there, and I only have so much time. But what I'm going to do is help you understand what they are, not each of them individually, but how they work, and then how we can use that to make a difference. So each of the Sustainable Development Goals, each of the 17, is broken down into targets and indicators. They're all goals, and they're broken into targets and indicators. The 17 of them, they kind of, the beginning third roughly, were the MDGs, but combined and reworked. The middle were sort of more economic, and then afterwards we have some that are more related to the environment and planet, of course. And then after that, we have the couple that are to really bring it all together. In project management, we know that as our integration. When you dig down into them, they each have targets, and total of over the 17 goals, there are 169 targets. There are some of them that are outcome targets. You can look at, we want this outcome by 2030. Some of them say by 2020, we want a particular outcome. So there are some like that you could measure. And then process targets, which are much larger. They tend to be global in scope. So maybe even a country couldn't achieve this target, but they can put together processes, policies, so that we as a global community can achieve the goals. And then on top of it, there are indicators. The indicators are specifically, how do we measure? What is it exactly that we're talking about? If you look at this example, clean water and sanitation, we would like clean water and sanitation on our planet. But then when you look a little bit deeper, we see that says ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. So we got a little bit more detail, and we can get more and more detail as we dive into each of these topics. So going down farther, here is one of the targets for clean water and sanitation. Sustainable Development Goal number 6 is the first goal that Project Managers Without Borders really focused on. We had all sorts of partners that were doing work in this area with sanitation, irrigation, the wells I talked about earlier, the training that Liz talked about earlier. So all of those had to do with clean water and sanitation. When you look at this particular target, it talks about increasing water use efficiency across all sectors. Well, Project Managers Without Borders didn't increase it across all sectors, but we are definitely increasing water use efficiency in our projects. And when you look at all of these, we'll say points of light, as they used to be called, maybe they still are in the world, but these not-for-profits, these NGOs, these CSOs, working in together and all focused on the same area, then we can do this across all sectors. Ensuring sustainable withdrawal and supply of fresh water to address water scarcity. So that's one of our projects. We really helped out a community in the Andes where water was scarce. They were in the middle of the Andes, and the community at the top was getting all the rain. Community at the bottom was getting the streams, because all the water is turned into rivers and streams. But the community in the middle had very little access to water. It was scarce. They could only grow certain crops because of it. The community wasn't very healthy. The community wasn't very wealthy. And it was very hard to have extra crops to sell when that was really where they were getting their income individually and as families. So we partnered with Engineers Without Borders. IEEE was a different project. Engineers Without Borders to help provide irrigation so that they could see the water going down, collect it, and then have it for use when they needed it. So when you look below at the indicators, that is really how to measure these things. It's not very specific when you see it, though. Change in water use efficiency over time. Change could mean either direction. So what you need to do as an organization, individual, government is take these indicators and goals and make them your own. You need to look at them and identify, well, what is it that we're going to do to fit into this? We'll define this as positive water use efficiency. We're going to improve the efficiency in this community, in this particular case that I was talking about, and have so many liters of water for so many tens of people. And we're going to, in our case, we wanted there to be enough water for each of the 300 families in the community. And we were able to achieve that goal, but that's how we fit that under the indicators that we show here. Another way of measuring how we're doing against each of these indicators in the Sustainable Development Goal, or each of these goals, is there's this organization that you see here. This is just one example. As I said, we can't go through all of the Sustainable Development Goals, but in the one that I'm providing as an example, here's an organization that is sharing how the world is doing in safely managed drinking water, using safely managed drinking water. Now, what you can see right away is that, well, in the actual interface, there's a slider down at the bottom, and you can see that, and you can see through time, through 2000 to 2022, how things have improved. What you can see in 2022, though, is that there are still many countries that we have no data for. We don't have, or at least this organization doesn't have that data. And those are the ones with the cross hatches. And so what has occurred over time is that we've gotten more data from other countries as we've gone along, and things have been improving. You can look at this per country. You can look at this for many of the other sustainable development goals. And this is important because if you're working toward some of these goals, you would like to know, well, where should I focus? If you're in one of the darker areas near 100%, 90%, maybe you should focus in an area that is one of the lighter colors, which means we either don't have data, maybe you can help us get data, or we can tell that we don't have safely managed drinking water in this country overall or in this area. Okay, so I keep talking about these. I wanted to bring this up one other time, this whole graphic, to help you see the extent of the goals. So we start with no poverty. That is sort of a number one big goal for all of these, for the planet, for the people. This is in the people track, and when you look at it, it's really hard to tell which ones are related to people. You could say all of them are related to people because everything impacts us as human beings. But when you look at this, it's so diverse. You look at work, economic growth, reduced inequalities. Number 17 is where project management can have a huge impact, and that is partnerships for the goals, the integration between them. But I would also say it's fantastic to focus in one. In our focus on number 6 in the beginning of our life as project managers without borders, we were able to learn so much about water use and wells, what's a good idea, what's not a good idea, and connect with people in that space. So we learned even more. So focusing on that and finding other organizations that are focusing in the area of your interest is extremely valuable. And we're individuals as well. So we can drive impact as individuals. This graphic is actually from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals site. And I'm not going to share the whole site. There are so many resources available to us. And as I said, we have links to those at the end. But this is the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. And it consists of these 3 levels. The first level is things you can do from your couch. So it's just amazing. From your couch with a mobile phone or a computer in your lap, or even, well, you're not on a couch if you're at a desktop, but you can do all sorts of things. You could have your bank statements come from electronically. You can turn off your lights. You can, well, some people can do that from their phone. Others, there's a clapping thing you can do, or there are a lot, yell to your child to turn off the light. You can do that all from your couch. Staying informed about what's happening in the world regarding the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically probably some that you're particularly interested in. If you share this information with others, then others are aware of what's happening, aware of the issues that we have, how well we're doing against any of these goals, and what they can do to help. Having more efficient appliances is useful. If there's any way to reduce your carbon emissions, you've seen in a lot, there are products that say, we'll reduce your carbon emissions. So when you're purchasing something new, maybe purchase something that has less plastic or less of anything or less packaging, whatever it is. There are so many things. This is the entire list from the site. for level 1. When you go to level 2, that's things you can do from within your house. And then level 3 is outside your house. I'll leave those to you to look at on your own later. But I will go to level 4, which is things you can do as an individual at work. So, since we're talking about the work environment, this is not their entire list. So again, I'd suggest that you go look at all of these links. But these are things that you can bring up as an individual. You don't have to be a project manager. They're concepts that you can bring up to your colleagues, to your work groups, to your leadership. As a stakeholder, as a shareholder in your company, you may be able to bring these up at a different level. So reducing waste is a very obvious one. If you work for Procter & Gamble, let's talk about reducing plastic. If you work for a computer company, and maybe we can reduce the amount of energy that we use. When you look at equality, there are all sorts of sustainable development goals. It's not all about the environment. We want to have equality, gender equality, and reduce discrimination of any kind. And so those are, if your diversity inclusion program, if you don't have one, you could start one. If you have one, you can contribute to it. There are so many opportunities that you have as an individual to make a difference in your company. When you, if you could talk to your company about any of these sustainable development goals, even if you talked about all of the sustainable development goals, if you put the beautiful, colorful picture up on your screen as a screensaver, you put it on your wall, people say, well, what is that? Or maybe they know, but you could share more information. You could say, I'm particularly interested in the no poverty one, the number 1. And here's why. Here's my experience. Here's what I'm doing. And you could join me. So if there are things that you can do as an individual from your government perspective, you can vote for the people who support what you support, your interests. You can write to your government. You can talk to your representatives. You can voice your support for the Paris Agreement so that we're all working toward, we all from a larger global perspective are working toward the same goals and committed to those goals. So we as committed individuals can work to help our governments be more committed, our companies be more committed. From a justice perspective, you could know your rights within your organization so that you have access to justice, and within your government, your country. And then you can help other people from that situation as well. So when you look at it, there are a number of ways that you could make a difference through the Sustainable Development Goals and the concepts that they are touting, this opportunity to focus on a particular area or 17 particular areas if you want to look at it more broadly. As a project professional, this is the one that is so close to my heart. What we can do as project professionals is align our project goals to be relevant to the relevant SDGs. So I have a project that I was just talking about that was providing irrigation to a community in the Andes Mountains in Ecuador. That clearly aligns with clean water and sanitation, but it also aligns with no poverty. And so if I only looked at it through that one lens, that one blue water lens, then I would see those goals and targets that I showed you earlier, but I wouldn't notice necessarily the poverty one. And so when you look at that, if you can identify where you can focus and where the impact comes from the multiple different sustainable development goals. When you manage your projects, you should manage them sustainably, which of course means balancing the three pillars of people, planet, and profit through your projects. So in order to do that, perhaps you could do an impact assessment of your project. You can identify, well, how will this impact the community? How will this impact the environment? How will this impact the economy of our organization? You're probably already monitoring that. You're probably already seeing how that's happening through your project. The economy of projects tends to be managed quite well, but the other aspects don't necessarily. When one of the situations there was a situation in Kenya where they were looking at life, number 15, life on land, and there was all sorts of aid going into Kenya to expand the land for wildlife reserves so that we didn't have the endangered species. We're supporting them so they were no longer endangered. And that went really well. The land expanded. They were purchasing more land. The animals would move on to the wildlife, would move on to the farms of the people there, and ended up actually destroying a lot of farmland and hurting the community, the people there. So they were actually, all of this effort, the money, the aid that was provided to support our SDG number 15 was actually harming our SDG number 1 in that particular case. And though they did have tourism and the dollars came in from tourism, dollars, they weren't dollars, but that money wasn't trickling down to the actual community that had to pay to improve their land and that was having the damage done to their crops. So keeping that all in mind is what we need to do, balance those in our professional projects. Doing those in any kind of projects is, of course, relevant as well. I have personal projects with Boy Scouts, or in my personal life, we just moved, and throughout that, looking at the balance. But I'm a project professional. I can apply those concepts to any project that I manage. Verifying that our projects align with sustainable practices, such as waste reduction, responsible sourcing, energy efficiency, responsible consumption. All of these concepts are out there and pretty well known by us, but we don't necessarily always consider them in our work projects. So making sure that we align to those practices is a way to make a difference, to really drive sustainable impact. And then when we track our progress in our projects, we should track sustainable development goal related targets as well. And we shouldn't just track them, we should share them. So in our projects, there's IEEE was an organization that we partnered with that I mentioned earlier accidentally. This is where I wanted to mention them. They have a great website they have IEEE Smart Village. When you go onto their website, they show the SDG little rectangles that we've been looking at and where they've made a difference in them, that they've been involved in lighting the world, and all of their metrics, or not all of them, but a lot of them are out there for people to see. That shows the impact that they're making, but also brings people together to say, well, wait a minute, what is this sustainable development goal? Oh, I see. They're supporting this clean energy concept. Oh, what is that about? And people may go back out, learn more about it through the UN, through other partners that are also looking into that space. So it's important to report those contributions, maybe through social media, certainly within your own organizations. If your project is meeting sustainable development goals, supporting sustainable development goals, That, I would bet, your organization wants to share with the world. And if you're within a PMO, you may have an opportunity to make it so that this impact assessment, for instance, is part of how you do things, your standard for your organization going forward. And when you share information within your organization, it might be contagious. It might really be what we need. Be an advocate for sustainable projects. So projects, I've been talking about how to manage projects sustainably, but I want to differentiate that and from what a sustainable project is. A sustainable project is managed sustainably, of course, but the impact of a sustainable project continues past the end of the project so that it's still successful and relevant. So an example is, I'll go back to Madagascar. We had all of these wells and things were going great until one of the wells broke. And the project is no longer valuable. It was considered a success in the beginning, but it's no longer valuable because the people can't get the benefit anymore. The project was not sustainable. They might have used sustainable practices. The project itself was not sustainable. All right. Other ways we can drive sustainable impact as project professionals: promoting the awareness of the Sustainable Development Goals and your sustainable projects. And you can do this anywhere. You can do it within your family. It's fantastic to share with the people that we spend the most time with and love the most what we're doing and why it matters to the world, to the planet, to our society, and our economy. And obviously we can do that everywhere. And I've talked about that from the professional perspective at your businesses a lot already. Collaborating with other organizations and finding a way so that you can help your local community achieve these goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, their goals, which are probably aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. This is where Project Managers Without Borders does our work. We build the capacity of organizations that support the Sustainable Development Goals. Building capacity means making it so that they can be more efficient and effective in the way that they achieve their missions. And how do you get efficient and effective? You apply project management skills and expertise. That's why our little icons in the corner are heroes, superheroes, because our skills are fantastic. We can apply them to anything in the world. We must apply them to any change in the world to make it happen. And what we're talking about here with the Sustainable Development Goals is change, managing change, positive change in the world. And the last item I have here is really the focus of the PMI Educational Foundation, mentoring young people in project management, but then also about sustainability. There are so many things that we could mentor. The Educational Foundation is mentoring young people, but we can mentor other people as well. We've mentored veterans, homeless people. In project management, there are so many other things that we can mentor in, but as a project management professional, that goes a long way. It makes it such that we can help them make even more of a difference in the world versus just consuming better, but helping them help a lot of people consume better, make decisions that are consistent with sustainability, with the pillars of sustainability, the people, profit, planet. So how will you drive sustainable impact? I would hope that is through the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Going to stop sharing.
Thanks so much. That was a great takeaway and such important information to hear about. We've got some questions. I'll start with one from Agnes, which said, are there any so-called agreed calculations for the methodology of having those sustainable goals? You mentioned that they're kind of conceptual because they apply differently in different situations, but are there any rules of thumb about those metrics?
Well, for organizations, well, we'll just say for governments, they put them in their development plans, right? They look at those huge, and thank you for the question, Agnes. They put them in their development plans, their foreign aid strategies, and what they do is they, as you saw, they're not extremely specific. Some of them are. They say, you know, reduce poverty by a certain amount by a certain time. All right, we have a goal that is quite clear and measurable. Not all of the sustainable development goals are, you know, the goals, or I should say the targets, because the goals themselves aren't necessarily, you know, something to measure because we have targets within that roll up to the goal. So some of them do have very measurable targets and indicators, so you know whether you've achieved this, and others aren't as clear. But it's okay. I know we, as you know, in our profession, we want it to be clear. But what we do, whoever is looking at this as an organization, individual, government, we look at that and identify how are we going to contribute to it? What are the metrics that we're going to measure, take, and how are we going to make the most impact through that sustainable development goal? And how are we going to partner with others that are doing the same? So we might say we're going to do this, but really this is our part. We need to partner with somebody else for the rest of it.
I like that focus on partnership. It's so practical in today's world of managing resources over time. Sophia asks, what are the main differences between aligning projects with relevant SDGs and aligning them with ESGs, environmental, social, and governmental metrics? Good question.
Yeah. So environmental, social, governmental versus environmental, social, economic. So that I'm not sure that I see a huge difference. If you look at the government's role is, well, the government's role is all of those, right? They've seen the environment often as least important because it's the people and the economy, but the government typically is how we can control our economy in various countries. Businesses can impact it as well, but I see them as useful in both cases. Whatever, you know, there are so many different templates or models in the world, and this is a useful one. The SDGs are a very useful model. If there's a different model that works, that's fantastic. Often you can even overlay them and say, well, all right, we do have our people, our planet, government. Okay, great. We'll overlay them, use different terminology. That's another thing that the SDGs do for us, is provide us with consistent terminology. When we're out there and we're trying to help organizations make an impact or make an impact ourselves, it really matters if we speak the same language, both from a natural language perspective, but just from a vocabulary perspective. And so if we can overlay models, that might be a way to combine the concepts. If you have two organizations or two efforts that are using different models, it may just work really well. So I would say that one isn't necessarily better than another. I would say use what's the most valuable in your particular situation, in your context.
Yeah, I will just mention also there's a comment made by Monique. Thank you for that very good answer about having a single language helps. And actually it's about doing good, however you want to brand it in a way, is another point, right? But Monique asks about your presentation, and I think the lazy man's guide to saving the world, or the lazy person's guide to saving the world, very much struck a chord. So I will say to everyone, we have a YouTube channel. These presentations will be available in replay. We also will eventually have a place where the presentations themselves might be as PDF forms, but we'll come back to you on that. We certainly will be able to have you replay these through our YouTube channel, and more will come on that at the end of the event. Now, I want to get onto a question from Eloise, who says, noting the difficulty of balancing the pillars, taking the systems approach, improving one aspect of water, could it impact people's current jobs? So what you were talking about in terms of the pros and cons of the draw. It says, do you have any methods for prioritizing issues or tools for assessing and understanding whether the overall impact is a positive?
That's a fantastic question. That's obviously what we need to do. I personally don't have a tool. I expect that they are out there. When you haven't, well, I know that they are. Impact assessments are out there, and so when from our perspective, our Project Managers Without Borders, our projects are relatively short and simple, and so we can say, all right, look at these pillars. And how are we impacting this? How are we impacting this? How are we impacting that? I mean, you can imagine that as a tool. If you want to call that a tool, it's a spreadsheet. And so that's a very simple one. I'm sure that more complex and maybe comprehensive ones exist for larger projects in certain spaces. I would think that if there is a particular, let's say that we're talking about smart cities, I would expect that there are all sorts of organizations that are invested in that space, who have identified how to measure what it is that we're doing, risks that we need to keep in mind when we do something, because usually, just as an example, the power for a smart city is something that we really have to think about. So that's a risk that we really need to consider. So, just like with other kinds of projects, there are specific risks that apply to specific kinds of projects, and that exists already out there. You talk with somebody, or organizations have these lists of risks, and the same exists in this case as well. So there are tools out there. They're not necessarily provided by Project Managers Without Borders, but they exist all over the place, and I'm sure that they're easily found once you identify the variables that you're looking for in this industry, for this sort of project, in this country, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I also think old-fashioned risk registers, where you look at risks and you talk about probability and impact, that model might work in some cases, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So we have another question from Elena, who says, in terms of the work that you're doing, how are you bringing incremental knowledge about sustainability to the younger people? Maybe you're doing that in some of the projects you're doing in local countries. What would you suggest?
In the projects that Project Managers Without Borders is doing, our goal isn't necessarily to teach about the Sustainable Development Goals. Our goal is to make an impact with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so what we're doing is we are helping organizations and who are supporting the Sustainable Development Goals make a difference through project management. From a youth perspective, the PMI Educational Foundation is absolutely using knowledge, sharing knowledge. They have templates, they have scholarships and efforts where they're sharing material on how to teach project management to the youth. I'm pretty sure that they're not teaching SDGs either. I would say that we need to combine them more in our space. It's not what I'm talking about it today, combined with project management. But from our organization's perspective, that's not the focus to teach about it. It's more to teach about and share and do and teach people to fish through project management, making the world a better place through project management.
And so maybe the call to action from you, if I could say it this way, is for us as project managers and members of PMI to actually become those advocates and influencers, and through our organizations, bring that message to youth and, of course, also everyone. Maybe one more question, and then we'll have to round it up, because there's lots of interest in your topic, of course, which is, okay, NGOs, we get. You can manage the sustainability goals and put that as part of your way of working. But how about for-profit companies? Does it work with corporations, and how?
Absolutely. There are all sorts of corporate social responsibility programs. Many organizations have programs where their employees volunteer, and then they claim, oh, we've had X% of our employees volunteer for the Sustainable Development Goals. It looks good, right? Or for this particular charity or effort that they're interested in. They also have, they can do their own reporting. And I think it's going to become more important for, well, I would say especially product makers, but services as well. I think the world is looking at corporations and asking, why is there so much plastic? Why is it this is so inefficient? Why does it cost so much? And I think it's a good point. There's more room for improvement there. It doesn't come naturally. And I think that we're getting there. And so it's certainly possible. It's happening. Organizations are improving in that space. And I look forward to seeing where else that they improve.
Me as well. Thank you so much, Deanna, for coming to us from the West Coast of America, because we know it's early time there. And thank you all for joining in. I think we all found this a very important conversation to join. There is a survey we'd like you to take, and when you answer that survey, you'll get the PDU code for this event if you are a PMP professional that's certified. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you at the next session. And thanks, Deanna, again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.